There is a psychological truth about betrayal that most people discover only after they have been hurt badly enough. Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is not the person you are actually in love with. What destroys you is the realization that the version of them you carried inside your mind was never completely real. You trusted the character you created from their words, their kindness, their attention, and the moments when they made you feel understood. Then one day, their behavior contradicts everything you believed about them, and suddenly you are not only losing a person, you are losing an entire story you built around that person. This is where Carl Jung's idea of projection becomes powerful. Human beings rarely see other people exactly as they are. We fill gaps with assumptions. Someone appears confident, and we automatically associate confidence with loyalty. Someone is attractive, and we may unconsciously attach kindness, intelligence, or emotional maturity to them. Someone understands us during one vulnerable conversation, and our mind can turn that single moment into an entire personality. Without realizing it, we begin completing the picture with qualities we desperately want to believe are there. And that is why disappointment can feel so much more painful than expected. Reality eventually starts revealing what imagination covered. It may happen through small things rather than one dramatic betrayal. The way they speak to you when nobody is watching, how quickly their attitude changes when you stop giving them attention, how they treat you when you disagree with them, or how their affection disappears when you are no longer useful to them. Slowly, you begin noticing something uncomfortable. The person you had created in your mind seems warmer, safer, and more caring than the actual person standing in front of you. Once you recognize this pattern, you begin observing people differently. You notice that people can behave completely differently depending on the environment they are in. Someone can appear supportive when you are alone with them and become dismissive when other people arrive. Someone can talk endlessly about honesty but become defensive the moment you tell them an uncomfortable truth. Someone can appear compassionate while they have nothing to gain, yet become cold the moment they lose control of the situation. The disturbing part is that not everyone who behaves this way is consciously acting. Human beings are complicated. Many people spend so much time protecting an image of themselves that they eventually start believing that image. Jung's concept of the persona describes the social face we present to the world, while the shadow represents aspects of ourselves that we prefer not to acknowledge. The greater the distance between the person someone presents and the parts of themselves they refuse to confront, the more tension eventually appears beneath the surface. That is why someone can seem completely different after you have known them for a long time. At first, you see the charm. Later, you notice the insecurity underneath it. You see generosity, then discover the need for admiration hiding behind it. You experience affection, and eventually recognize the desire for control mixed into it. The mask does not always disappear in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it simply becomes harder to maintain. People often say they are afraid of being judged, but sometimes the deeper fear is being understood too completely. Being seen means that the carefully constructed image can no longer protect them, and this is also why learning to stop idealizing people can feel strangely uncomfortable. You begin realizing that some of your deepest emotional pain was not created entirely by another person's actions. Part of it came from the expectations, assumptions, and fantasies your own mind attached to them. After that realization, your way of looking at relationships changes. You stop giving words unlimited authority and start paying attention to patterns. You watch what someone repeatedly does when they are angry, disappointed, jealous, bored, or denied what they want. You notice whether their kindness survives boundaries. You notice whether their respect remains when you disagree. You notice whether their affection exists only when you are available to them. Human behavior often reveals itself most clearly when circumstances change. Some people become warmer when they feel you slipping away. Some suddenly show interest when you stop chasing them. Some only appreciate your presence after experiencing your absence. And this does not necessarily mean that everyone is calculating or manipulative. Sometimes people simply become aware of value when something they took for granted is no longer guaranteed. This is why kindness without boundaries can become dangerous. If you constantly tolerate disrespect, some people may eventually interpret your tolerance as permission. If you always rescue someone from the consequences of their actions, they may never learn responsibility. If you repeatedly sacrifice yourself to maintain a relationship, the other person may begin treating your sacrifice as normal rather than extraordinary. You can see these dynamics everywhere. In school, at work, in friendships, and inside families, People quickly learn which individuals will tolerate being ignored, mocked, used, or pushed aside. Sometimes, the loudest person receives attention, while the quietest person becomes invisible. Sometimes, someone who constantly gives to others is appreciated less than the person who demands everything. Human beings can unconsciously respond to confidence, boundaries, status, and social power long before they consciously think about fairness. Jung's concept of projection adds another layer to all of this. People can sometimes attack in others what they cannot accept within themselves. Someone deeply insecure may become obsessed with accusing others of seeking attention. A person who struggles with honesty may constantly question everyone else's loyalty. Someone who fears losing control may describe controlling behavior as protection. A person terrified of abandonment may become so demanding that they eventually push others away. None of this means that every accusation is projection or that every difficult person is secretly toxic. The important lesson is to stop trying to understand someone through one isolated moment. A single mistake tells you very little. A repeated pattern tells you much more. People reveal themselves through repetition. Watch how someone behaves when they have nothing to gain. Watch how they treat people who cannot help them. Watch how they respond when you say no. Watch what happens when you succeed, when you fail, when you become independent, or when you stop constantly giving them access to your attention. Those moments often reveal more than hundreds of beautiful words ever could. The friend who appears only when they need emotional support. The person who turns every conversation into a quiet competition. The partner who remembers your weaknesses but forgets your sacrifices. The person who collects your vulnerabilities and later uses them against you. These patterns matter because they show you who someone repeatedly chooses to be, not merely who they claim to be. And perhaps the greatest form of emotional maturity is learning to accept people as they actually are, instead of constantly negotiating with the version of them you wish existed. You do not have to hate someone after discovering their reality. You simply have to stop confusing your projection with their personality. You can care about someone and still recognize their limitations. You can forgive someone and still maintain distance. You can love someone and still refuse to abandon yourself for them. The moment you stop trying to turn people into the characters you imagined, relationships become much clearer. You become less impressed by promises and more interested in consistency, less fascinated by charm and more attentive to character, less desperate to be chosen and more concerned with whether the person choosing you is capable of treating you with respect. Because eventually, everyone reveals something. Not necessarily through one confession, one betrayal, or one dramatic event, but through the small decisions they make again and again. And when you learn to watch those patterns without romanticizing them, you stop falling in love with illusions. You begin seeing people as they are. And strangely enough, that does not make you colder. It makes your love more honest. You no longer love someone because your imagination tells you who they should be. You decide whether they deserve your trust based on what reality repeatedly shows you. That is the moment projection loses its power, and you finally begin relating to people as they truly exist, rather than as you desperately hoped they would. And this is where the real psychological conflict begins, because the more you depend on acceptance, the more carefully you begin editing yourself. You learn which opinions create approval, which emotions make people uncomfortable, which weaknesses attract sympathy, and which truths should remain unspoken. Eventually, you can become so skilled at being acceptable that you forget what it feels like to be authentic. You may still have friends. You may still receive messages, invitations, compliments, and attention. From the outside, everything can look perfectly normal, but internally, something feels wrong. You are surrounded by people, yet you feel strangely unseen. You are speaking, but you are not expressing yourself. You are laughing, but part of you is constantly monitoring whether the laughter sounds natural. You are participating in relationships while quietly wondering whether anyone would still choose you if you stopped performing. That question can be frightening because it forces you to confront the difference between being loved and being useful. When people are accustomed to receiving a certain version of you, your transformation can feel like betrayal to them. You become less available and they call you distant. You become more honest and they call you difficult. You establish boundaries and suddenly you are accused of changing. But sometimes changing is exactly what healing looks like. The strange thing about personal growth is that it does not only change you, it changes the psychological balance of your relationships. When you stop over-explaining, People who depended on your explanations may become frustrated. When you stop constantly apologizing, people who benefited from your guilt may feel threatened. When you stop chasing approval, people who controlled you through rejection may lose their influence. This is why growth can reveal relationships that were never as unconditional as you believed. You do not necessarily have to expose anyone. You do not need to confront everyone. Simply change your behavior and observe what happens. The reaction itself can become information. Someone who genuinely cares about you may need time to adjust, but they will eventually respect your boundaries. Someone who only valued your availability may become angry when access to you becomes limited. Someone who loved your dependence may suddenly describe your independence as selfishness. The difference is subtle, but incredibly important. And once you begin seeing this, you also become more careful with your own behavior, because awareness is not supposed to become a weapon for judging everyone else. Jung's ideas were never simply about identifying the shadow in other people. The difficult part is recognizing the shadow within yourself. You have your own projections, you have your own defenses, you have your own moments when you call something love, because admitting that it is attachment would hurt too much. You may call yourself patient when you are actually afraid of confrontation. You may call yourself forgiving when you are terrified of being alone. You may call yourself understanding when, deep down, you are accepting treatment you know you should not accept. That is the uncomfortable mirror psychology places in front of us. It does not allow you to remain the innocent observer forever. Eventually, you have to ask what role you played in maintaining the illusion. Maybe you ignored the warning signs because the truth would have forced you to leave. Maybe you kept explaining someone's behavior because accepting their character would destroy the future you imagined with them. Maybe you stayed because being disappointed by someone felt easier than admitting you had invested years into the wrong relationship. The mind does this to protect itself. It prefers a painful explanation that preserves the relationship over a painful truth that destroys it. So, it creates stories. They are stressed. They had a difficult childhood. They are scared of intimacy. They didn't mean what they said. They will change eventually. Sometimes those explanations are true, but explanations do not erase consequences. Understanding why someone behaves badly does not require you to remain available for that behavior. This distinction can change your entire life. You can understand someone's wounds without volunteering to become their emotional target. You can recognize someone's insecurity without allowing them to control you. You can have compassion without sacrificing your self-respect. That is what mature awareness looks like. It is not becoming suspicious of everyone. It is becoming capable of seeing people without needing to distort reality to keep them in your life. And when you develop that ability, your relationships become quieter. You stop trying to convince people to understand you. You stop chasing people who repeatedly withdraw their affection to control your behavior. You stop turning every disagreement into a crisis. You begin choosing peace over psychological games. Some people will disappear when you stop participating in those games. Let them. Not every ending is a tragedy. Some endings are simply the moment reality becomes stronger than attachment. You may lose people when you become more authentic, but you also lose something else, the exhausting responsibility of constantly maintaining an identity that was never truly yours. Eventually, you begin asking a different question. Not, how can I make people accept me? But, who am I when I no longer need to be accepted? That question is where individuation begins. It is the movement toward becoming a more complete version of yourself, rather than endlessly adapting to whatever environment you are in. You begin separating your identity from the roles people gave you. You are no longer only the good friend, the successful person, the obedient child, the dependable partner, or the person everyone calls when they need something. You become interested in the person underneath all those roles. And that person may be unfamiliar at first. You may discover that some of your beliefs were inherited, some of your ambitions were created to impress people who are no longer even present in your life. Some of your fears were taught to you by people who were themselves afraid. Some of your definitions of success were never chosen by you at all. This is why becoming conscious can feel lonely before it feels liberating. You are dismantling an identity that once helped you belong. You are learning to tolerate disappointing people. You are learning that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of being honest. But slowly, something changes. You stop needing every person to understand your choices. You stop explaining your boundaries to people committed to misunderstanding them. You stop confusing attention with affection, intensity with intimacy, and familiarity with trust. You begin watching what happens when you simply become yourself. Some people will move closer because they finally feel that they are interacting with the real you. Others will move away because the version of you they benefited from no longer exists. And strangely, both outcomes are valuable, because the goal was never to keep everyone. The goal was to stop abandoning yourself just to keep them. That is the point where the illusion finally breaks. Not when you discover that other people are flawed, because everyone is flawed. The real awakening happens when you understand that you are also capable of creating illusions, defending them, and suffering because of them. You stop asking, why did they become this person? And you start asking, why did I need them to be someone else? That question is painful, but it is also freeing. Because once you can see your own projections, you become less vulnerable to them. You can appreciate someone without idealizing them. You can love someone without worshipping them. You can trust someone without surrendering your judgment. You can walk away without turning them into a villain. And perhaps that is one of the deepest forms of emotional freedom, seeing people clearly without needing to hate them for what you see. You no longer need the fantasy. You can finally deal with reality. And reality may not always give you the people you imagined, but it gives you something far more valuable: the opportunity to know who is actually standing in front of you and who you become when you stop pretending not to see. You begin noticing the emotional mechanics behind ordinary interactions. Instead of immediately reacting to someone's words, you start wondering what is happening underneath them. Is this person genuinely expressing something, or are they trying to create a particular reaction in me? Are they asking for understanding, or are they attempting to escape responsibility? Are they offering affection because they care, or because they are afraid of losing access to me? That kind of awareness can make life feel strangely different. Conversations that once seemed simple begin revealing layers you never noticed before. A compliment can contain insecurity. Silence can contain resentment. Anger can hide fear. Excessive confidence can conceal shame. And sometimes kindness can even become a strategy for receiving something in return. But there is an important danger here. Once you learn to recognize manipulation, you can become obsessed with finding it everywhere. You begin analyzing every message, every pause, every change in someone's tone. You start assuming that every act of kindness has an ulterior motive, and that every relationship is secretly a transaction. You become so focused on protecting yourself from deception that you lose your ability to experience genuine connection. That is not awareness anymore. That is hypervigilance disguised as wisdom. Real psychological maturity does not mean expecting the worst from everyone. It means becoming capable of seeing both possibilities. Someone can be imperfect and still sincere. Someone can make a selfish decision without being fundamentally malicious. Someone can disappoint you without secretly planning to destroy you. The goal is not to become impossible to hurt. The goal is to become capable of surviving disappointment without losing your sense of reality. This is where emotional independence becomes powerful. You stop demanding certainty from other people. You understand that no human being can provide absolute guarantees. People change. Circumstances change. Feelings change. Even you change. So instead of asking someone to promise that they will never hurt you, you develop enough self-trust to know that if they do, you will be able to respond. That changes the entire psychology of attachment. You no longer cling because you are terrified of losing someone. You stay because you genuinely choose to stay. You no longer tolerate everything because you fear loneliness. You tolerate what is reasonable because you understand that every relationship requires imperfection, while still knowing where your boundaries begin. And this is perhaps the difference between attachment and conscious love. Attachment says, I need you to remain the person I imagined. Conscious love says, I see who you are, and I will decide what I can honestly accept. That decision requires courage, because reality is rarely as beautiful as fantasy. But reality is also rarely as terrifying as the stories fear creates. When you stop idealizing people, you stop being devastated every time they reveal another imperfection. You begin expecting human complexity. You can appreciate someone's good qualities without pretending they have no weaknesses. You can recognize their mistakes without turning them into monsters. And eventually, you begin applying the same standard to yourself. You notice your own contradictions. You realize that you also want to be understood, while sometimes failing to understand others. You want honesty but occasionally avoid difficult conversations. You want unconditional acceptance while secretly judging people who disappoint you. You want freedom but sometimes become anxious when someone else exercises theirs. This realization can be humbling. But humility is not weakness. It is what happens when the ego no longer needs to maintain an image of perfection. A person who knows their own darkness becomes less fascinated by appearing pure. They do not need to constantly prove that they are the good person in every story. They can admit when they were wrong. They can apologize without turning the apology into another performance. They can recognize jealousy without allowing jealousy to control their behavior. They can feel anger without immediately turning it into punishment. That is what makes self-awareness different from self-image. Self-image asks, how do I appear? Self-awareness asks, what is actually happening inside me? The first protects the ego, the second transforms it. And transformation can be uncomfortable because it removes excuses. Once you become conscious of a pattern, you can no longer honestly pretend that you did not see it. You notice the moment you become defensive. You notice the desire to make someone feel guilty. You notice the impulse to withdraw affection as punishment. You notice when you want attention more than connection. You notice when you are listening only because you are waiting for your turn to speak. These moments may not feel flattering, but they are valuable. They are opportunities to interrupt a pattern before it becomes behavior. That is the real purpose of awareness, not to make you perfect, to give you a moment between impulse and action. Because the unconscious person experiences an emotion and immediately becomes it. They feel jealousy, so they attack. They feel rejection, so they punish. They feel insecurity, so they seek control. They feel fear, so they create distance. The conscious person can still experience all of those emotions. The difference is that they can observe them. They can say, I am feeling threatened right now. And that sentence creates space. Inside that space, choice becomes possible. Maybe the jealousy does not need to become an accusation. Maybe the insecurity does not need to become manipulation. Maybe the fear does not need to become withdrawal. Maybe the desire for control can simply be recognized and allowed to pass. This is how psychological freedom develops, not by eliminating difficult emotions, but by refusing to let every emotion become an instruction. And once you reach that point, relationships become different again. You become less interested in finding perfect people and more interested in finding emotionally honest ones. You stop searching for someone without flaws and start looking for someone capable of confronting their flaws. Because everyone has a shadow. The difference is whether they know it exists. Someone who understands their own darkness is often safer than someone desperately convinced they have none. They know they can become defensive, so they learn to pause. They know they can become jealous, so they communicate instead of controlling. They know they can become selfish, so they question their motives. They know they can hurt people, so they take responsibility when they do. That is not perfection. That is consciousness. And perhaps this is where Jung's deeper message becomes most relevant. The purpose of psychological growth is not to become a person without darkness. It is to become a person who no longer needs to hide from it. Because what you refuse to acknowledge does not simply disappear. It waits. It influences your reactions, your relationships, your choices, and sometimes the people you repeatedly attract. But when you bring those hidden parts into awareness, they lose some of their unconscious control over you. You become less divided, less performative, less desperate to prove who you are. And eventually, you reach a strange kind of peace. You no longer need everyone to be good. You no longer need everyone to understand you. You no longer need every relationship to survive. You simply need to remain honest enough with yourself to recognize what is real. That is when solitude stops feeling like rejection. It becomes space. Space to think. Space to observe. Space to hear your own thoughts without the constant noise of other people's expectations. And from that space, something unexpected happens. You become capable of being alone without feeling abandoned. You become capable of loving without possessing. You become capable of trusting without surrendering your judgment. You become capable of leaving without needing revenge. And most importantly, you become capable of seeing another human being clearly without turning them into either a hero or a villain. Because maturity is not the discovery that everyone is terrible. It is the realization that everyone is complicated, including you. And once you can accept that truth without becoming cynical, you have crossed an important psychological threshold. You are no longer living entirely through projection. You are beginning to see reality. And reality, unlike fantasy, does not need to be perfect to be meaningful. You begin noticing how desperately people try to escape themselves, Some disappear into relationships, others chase status, achievement, constant attention, entertainment, social media, endless conversations, or endless stimulation. Anything can become an escape when silence feels threatening, because silence removes the distractions, and once the distractions disappear, a person is left alone with the thoughts, fears, insecurities, and unresolved emotions they have spent years avoiding. That is why genuine self-confrontation can feel so uncomfortable. When there is nothing left to distract you, you begin hearing your own mind without filters. You start noticing patterns you previously blamed on circumstances. You realize that some of your choices were not random at all. They were familiar. Jung's famous idea that unconscious patterns can direct our lives points towards something deeply uncomfortable. Much of human behavior happens before conscious reasoning ever gets involved. A person may believe they simply fell in love, while unconsciously repeating an attachment pattern learned years earlier. Someone may believe they always meet the wrong people, while repeatedly choosing personalities that feel emotionally familiar. Another person may insist that everyone eventually betrays them, while ignoring the warning signs that were visible from the beginning. The human mind does not always choose what is healthy. It often chooses what is familiar, and familiarity can feel strangely safe, even when it causes pain. This explains why some people repeatedly return to relationships that hurt them, friendships that drain them, and emotional situations they already know will end badly. The pain is familiar. The uncertainty of something healthier can actually feel more frightening than the suffering they already understand. Change threatens that familiarity. It threatens identity. If someone has spent years defining themselves as the victim, healing can feel like losing an important part of their identity. If someone has built their worth around being needed, healthy boundaries can feel like rejection. If someone has survived by controlling everything around them, vulnerability can feel like weakness. So people often defend the identity they have built, even when that identity is hurting them. Once you understand this, certain behaviors become easier to interpret. The disrespect, the projection, the emotional inconsistency, the sudden hostility, the need for control. Sometimes these reactions are not truly about you. You may simply have touched a part of another person that they have spent years avoiding. Your confidence can remind someone of their insecurity. Your independence can threaten someone who needs control. Your progress can force someone to notice their own lack of progress. Your boundaries can expose another person's entitlement, and instead of confronting those uncomfortable feelings, they may direct them toward you. Sometimes this happens openly. Sometimes it is much more subtle. A little less support, a colder tone, a joke that carries an unexpected sting, a sudden withdrawal of affection, passive-aggressive comments, silence used as punishment, small emotional changes that are difficult to explain to someone who was not there. But you notice them. Especially after your awareness becomes sharper, you begin sensing what exists underneath the words: competition underneath certain compliments, resentment underneath friendliness, insecurity underneath excessive confidence, tension underneath politeness. The social mask starts becoming easier to recognize, and this can create another danger: cynicism. Because once you realize how much performance exists in human interaction, you may begin assuming that all connection is fake. You may start believing that every kindness has an agenda, every compliment hides jealousy, and every relationship is simply a transaction disguised as affection. That conclusion feels intelligent at first. It can even feel protective. You tell yourself that you have finally understood people. You stop trusting easily. You stop becoming emotionally vulnerable. You convince yourself that distance is wisdom and that caring too much is weakness. But that is not freedom, that is another prison. The opposite of naivety is not cynicism. It is discernment. There is a difference between seeing that people are capable of deception and believing that everyone is deceiving you. There is a difference between having boundaries and building walls around yourself. There is a difference between being careful with trust and becoming incapable of trust. Jung's deeper psychological message was not about becoming suspicious of humanity. It was about becoming conscious of humanity, including your own. Because the moment you begin seeing everyone else's shadow, you eventually have to confront yours. You may discover that you also have impulses you would rather hide. You may feel jealous when someone succeeds. You may secretly enjoy being needed. You may want attention while pretending you do not care about it. You may withdraw affection when you feel rejected. You may judge others for behaviors that exist in smaller forms inside yourself, and that realization can be deeply humbling. But it can also be liberating. Because once you recognize your own capacity for darkness, you no longer need to pretend that you are morally superior to everyone else. You become more careful with your actions because you understand what you are capable of under pressure. You learn to recognize the moment when insecurity becomes jealousy, the moment when hurt becomes the desire to punish, the moment when love becomes possession, the moment when confidence becomes arrogance, the moment when boundaries become emotional walls. Awareness does not remove these impulses. It gives you the ability to notice them before they control your behavior. And that may be one of the most important differences between unconscious living and conscious living. The unconscious person experiences an emotion and immediately acts through it. The conscious person can experience the same emotion and pause. They can feel anger without becoming cruel. They can feel jealousy without becoming controlling. They can feel rejection without trying to destroy the person who rejected them. They can feel loneliness without returning to a relationship that repeatedly harms them. They can feel fear without allowing fear to make every decision. That pause is where freedom begins. Because you cannot control every thought that enters your mind, but you can become more conscious of which thoughts deserve your obedience. And eventually, this changes the way you understand people. You stop expecting perfection. You stop being shocked by contradiction. You stop assuming that someone's kindness means they will never disappoint you, or that someone's mistake makes them completely evil. You begin seeing human beings as complicated creatures capable of opposing qualities at the same time. Someone can love you and still hurt you. Someone can care about you and still be selfish. Someone can be sincere and still be emotionally immature. Someone can have good intentions and still cause damage. And you can be a good person while still having parts of yourself that need work. That is reality. Not optimistic, not pessimistic, just reality. And when you stop romanticizing people, something surprising happens. You become slower to trust, but the trust you give becomes deeper. You become less impressed by charm and more interested in consistency. You become harder to manipulate because you no longer need someone to be the person you imagined. You listen to words, but you watch behavior. You appreciate affection, but you observe whether respect remains when circumstances change. You accept apologies, but you look for patterns afterward. You give people opportunities, but you no longer confuse unlimited access with unconditional love. You also become less addicted to attention. You stop measuring your worth by who responds to you, who chooses you, who praises you, or who stays. And that creates a strange kind of freedom, because when you are no longer terrified of losing someone, manipulation becomes much harder. A person who can walk away cannot easily be controlled through withdrawal. A person who can tolerate solitude cannot easily be controlled through loneliness. A person who trusts their own perception cannot easily be controlled through endless denial and confusion. But perhaps the deepest lesson is not about protecting yourself from other people. It is about protecting yourself from your own projections. Because the greatest danger was never simply that someone could deceive you. It was that your loneliness could convince you to ignore what you saw. Your desire could convince you to excuse what hurt you. Your hope could convince you that someone would eventually become the person you needed them to be. And your imagination could make a relationship with a fantasy feel more real than a relationship with reality. Once you understand that, something inside you becomes quieter. You no longer need to turn everyone into a hero. You no longer need to turn everyone into a villain. You simply observe, you listen, you notice. You accept what reality repeatedly shows you, and perhaps that is what genuine psychological maturity looks like. Not becoming cold, not becoming suspicious, not becoming detached from humanity, but becoming conscious enough to love without illusion, trust without blindness, forgive without surrendering yourself, and walk away without hatred when something is no longer healthy for you. Because the day you stop romanticizing people is also the day you stop asking them to complete a fantasy that existed inside your own mind. You stop demanding that reality match your imagination, and strangely, that is when reality becomes easier to accept. You finally understand that people are imperfect, contradictory, wounded, loving, selfish, generous, fearful, courageous, and constantly changing, including you. And when you can accept that without becoming cynical, you become much harder to manipulate and much easier to understand. You no longer need to be shocked by human nature. You simply recognize it. You recognize the masks. You recognize the shadows. You recognize the projections. And most importantly, you recognize your own. That is where awareness begins. Not when you discover that other people are flawed, but when you become honest enough to see yourself without the mask too. If this made you realize something uncomfortable about people or about yourself, write "aware" in the comments.